You know, Metallica have always been one of those bands that I've found really easy to poke fun at, despite my love for a lot of their material, and that trend has remained pretty consistent once again for this new album. That's right, we've got a brand new Metallica record here, the follow-up to 2016's Hardwired to Self-Destruct. This one is called 72 Seasons. I don't think I need to do much of an introduction here. It's Metallica, the legendary San Francisco-based metal band, one of the biggest bands of all time. Moving on. When I was a kid, the first CD that I bought with my own money was a copy of And Justice for All, and it really was my introduction to a lot of heavier music. The tracks on that album are still, to me, absolute classics, despite their very glaring issues with production and the obvious drum loops where Lars couldn't keep time, you know, all of that fun stuff. Now, what I'm getting at is Metallica have always been a really easy target for criticism for as long as I can remember. This is, after all, a review, so I am going to be dropping some hot takes, but I've been trying my best to kind of just go into this with as much of an open mind as I can. Now, I also went back and listened to some of the more recent Metallica albums in preparation for this release. No, I did not listen to Saint Anger simply because I really just didn't want to. But I did go back and I listened to Death Magnetic and Hardwired to Self-Destruct, as well as a little bit of Lulu. I think for a very long time now, there's been a lot of pressure from fans for Metallica to return to some of the early thrash roots of the band, and for several records now, that's been something that has just been looming over these guys' heads. I think with the sudden burst in attention that Stranger Things brought to Master of Puppets, that whole idea of a return to traditional thrash got put front and center once again, but this time it really feels like Metallica have kind of found a good, surprisingly well-balanced path between that early testosterone-fueled punk-heavy thrash and speed metal and their later 90s output that brought the band a lot of mass appeal after the switch from metal and grunge to more alternative rock. Now, I'm not saying that Metallica have necessarily knocked it out of the park on this one, because I do have some problems with this record. I've got some gripes with it, but I am genuinely impressed by the way Metallica have approached this one, because by all accounts, they aren't really trying to reinvent the wheel here, but what they've done is they've taken an experienced and maybe a bit more of a wise, thoughtful stroke of creativity on a lot of these songs that I frankly just wasn't expecting. A lot of the biggest issues that I had on Death Magnetic and Hardwired was that every song on those albums really sounded like Metallica was trying to write a song that they had already written, again, with maybe a few exceptions. There are definitely moments on those albums where some great original ideas come through, like the track Spit Out the Bone or All Nightmare Long, and maybe some not so great but still original ideas also reared their heads, like the track Murder One, which I think would have been a really touching tribute to Lemmy from Motorhead if it wasn't for the fact that that song is just so pathetically terrible. But yes, the majority of this record actually feels like they're not trying to write an album that they've already released, but instead they're just writing a Metallica record for the first time in a very long time. Now, that does have its issues. Metallica are unquestionably the biggest metal band of all time, bar none, but even with that status, they've always kind of had their issues. Like I said, they're kind of an easy target because the issues on this record are very much the same kinds of problems typical with pretty much any Metallica release. Just to name a few things, you can start with James Hetfield's lyrical ability, which admittedly has come pretty far since tracks like Invisible Kid, which does still get a laugh out of me if I hear it. There's obviously the all too familiar problem of production issues with the drums, which fortunately are nowhere near as bad as the Saint Anger snare drum tones, nor are they as noticeably barren as the drums from And Justice for All, though I think the problem here is definitely more in line with the latter issue. And of course, my final issue here is with Kirk Hammett's guitar solos, which swing dramatically from actually being really good to something that you would hear on the floor of a Guitar Center demoed through a Line 6. Those generally end up being the biggest gripes that I have with the album, though there are other smaller things here and there. Starting off the album, of course, is the title track 72 Seasons, which admittedly since dropping as a single has grown on me more, especially after now having heard the full record. The one thing that does kind of get me about this song is how similar at points this track feels to Spit Out the Bone, the last track from Hardwired. In a way, it kind of feels like a continuation, which I think does sort of work narratively here. James Hetfield's vocal work does sound really good considering his age. It's kind of hard to not immediately draw comparisons to the latest Megadeth record, The Sick, the Dying, and the Dead, but yeah, the last decade has been a lot kinder to the Metallica camp as far as vocal ability is concerned. This song does also have one of the better guitar solos on the record. There's still some points of that solo that sound a little bit too on the nose for Hammett as a player, but still, all things considered, it's still a very solid guitar solo. I think the one issue that really does appear on every single track is the drum production issue, which does rear its head at some point on every single song. It kind of just sounds like the drums are out of place, not all the time, mind you, but it pops up on all of the tracks at really weird points. Shadows Follow is another pretty solid song, very Black Album heavy as far as the writing goes. There's some really solid and groovy hooks on this song, and Hetfield is doing a really good job balancing these sort of off-kilter grooves with another sort of staggered delivery on his vocals, which I think works great. This is easily a highlight track on this album for me. Also, the guitar solo, which isn't necessarily the most remarkable here, is still one of the better ones on the record, certainly not an unworthy inclusion here. Screaming Suicide is kind of the second swing in a 1-2 punch. Really solid riffs on this track. Hetfield does have a bit of a goofy lead up to the chorus with these lines that are sort of crooned, and like these lines of "keep me inside, my name is suicide," which is maybe a little bit too close in the territory of just a rhyme without a reason lyrically, but in this case, this track is kind of maybe a little bit presumptuous about its weight here. I do think it's an important song for the album, and it is generally one of the better songs here, especially after this point, because things become a lot more of a mixed bag. Sleepwalk My Life Away starts off with this really cool bass and drum marching beat that is kind of unlike anything that I've ever really heard Metallica do, and it is pretty cool. I think they've made a really solid intro for a song that ultimately feels a little bit long-winded. It also doesn't help that the main riff on this track kind of sounds like a bastardization of the Enter Sandman riff. This track also is one that is particularly bad about how the drums are mixed. The cymbals and overdubbed kick are really distracting and pull attention away from what is actually a fairly decent vocal performance that reasonably should be front and center in this mix, but for some reason you just get an earful of like cymbal and hi-hat crashes. Things don't really improve much for You Must Burn, which is a long song. It's over 7 minutes, and it has some of the best riffs on the album that are really reminiscent of like Tony Martin era Black Sabbath, with sort of a hint of Black Album writing choices and even like a twist of some sort of Alice in Chains style vocals. But despite having some of the elements that I would really like, this song really leaves a lot to be desired, again on the production side of things. Namely, the mix just sounds really barren on the high end of things. There's really some chunky and satisfying lows, but the only thing that sticks out in the highs, again, are those really obnoxious cymbals. Beyond that, I can dig the occult themes. It's really refreshing to see Metallica take this route writing-wise and not just end up writing another Lovecraft track. Lux Eterna I have mixed feelings on because it is a hard-hitting, straight-to-the-point track, but after hearing everything this album has to offer, it is possibly holder for one of the worst guitar solos on the album. And I get that there was that whole article where Kirk was talking about how it's harder to write good solos in pentatonic than doing some fancy sweep picking techniques or whatever, and I don't disagree with him, but I just don't understand why that's the hill that you would choose to die on. Like, yeah, it is hard to write good sounding solos in pentatonic, clearly, because this one isn't good, so why didn't you use something more suitable? I mean, I guess it is suitable, seeing as this is in spirit an early Metallica track, and a lot of that heavy technicality wasn't really introduced into thrash until a few years into this whole genre being a thing. But it's just so meat and potatoes that the only response that I have as a gut reaction is just a massive eye roll. Crown of Barbed Wire is admittedly a pretty sick song title. Past that though, this song has some serious middle of the album syndrome. James Hetfield gives one of his most strained vocal performances here, which they do mostly make work, but this really is the only song here where it does feel like he's showing his age, though he really is pushing for a more expressive vocal performance, more akin to like their Load and Reload era records, so I can see that being a bit of an issue. So it's admirable, but I see this as kind of being a fumbled track, because beyond what is close to being a decent vocal performance, you get one of the least adventurous songs on the album. And I mean, listening to this thing, like the last half dozen or so times I've put this album on, this track is one that I've consistently forgotten about the most. Chasing Light, I think, is a bit of a sleeper track. I think this pulls things back a bit from the edge, though listening to this song, I can't help but think of that part in Some Kind of Monster where Hetfield is talking about his vocal lessons, because they've clearly helped over the years, especially so here with these surprisingly well done high vocals, which is kind of weird considering how bad the last track was vocally. I do think this song does toe that line between the heavy hard rock side of things that Metallica does and that vaguely southern rock sound that they somehow keep coming back to. If Darkness Had a Sun, I think, was a pretty brilliant move as far as marketing goes, with the whole TikTok play along with Metallica thing they did to kind of promote the release of this track. And it's kind of a shame with just how much this song just drops the ball lyrically with the overuse of the whole temptation thing, and just a lot of generally overly done lyrical cliches and tropes, which is a damn shame because this song has a pretty interesting switch up between the guitars and the drums during some of the verses, which I personally really like. So it kind of just feels especially bad because of how much this song just lyrically misses. Too Far Gone is a really solid late album track, very high energy. It reminds me a lot of Holier Than Thou as far as song structure goes, which is pretty solid, as that is one of my favorite cuts from the Black Album. I do really like the double time jam that happens midway through the track. This is definitely another highlight song on this record for me. Room of Mirrors is really the last point on the album that feels feels like it's tapping that young, fast, aggressive, and angry motif for its main style, and again, it does work really well. It is kind of remarkable how well Metallica pick up this style when they do actually decide to write within it, and honestly, it's given me a lot more respect for them as songwriters, because it's moments like this where it really feels like, yeah, you know, they do still got it. Enamorada is a weird track. It's 11 minutes long, one of the longest in the Metallica catalog, if not the longest, depending on if we're actually counting any material from Lulu. And it really feels like they looked back at some of their most divisive mid-90s material and decided that that is what they wanted to pull from mainly for this track. It's just such a weird time capsule of a song. It's got like that Hetfield crooning, like he's doing that hard arena rock thing. The drums are slow and lazy. The hooks are confusingly juxtaposed with these minor progressions that just sort of throw the whole flow of the song into a weird limbo. There's a really typically wah-heavy guitar solo that is actually pretty good, but this one is just loaded with so many odd writing choices that I can't really decide if this track is good or bad. Honestly, I kind of just respect the commitment of choosing this absolutely confusing 11-minute long track as the last song on the album, because that's kind of the most Metallica thing ever. If there's one thing that screams Metallica, it's just absolutely baffling anyone that listens to your music. It reminds me of the whole unpredictability thing, where if you don't fully grasp what you're doing, no one else can really predict what you're going to do, and I think that this is sort of the musical equivalent of that, and I think it might be based. Anyway, I've enjoyed picking apart this album. I certainly think that there's moments here that I am just never going to like all that much, but there's also a lot of really cool riffs and catchy hooks that are really classic Metallica to a T. So if you're wondering about this record, I definitely say it's worth a listen, because it's surprisingly multifaceted for an album that I frankly would not have expected from Metallica at this point in their career. And despite the midsection of this album falling off a bit and being a bit touch and go, for me personally, I think stepping back from it and just looking at those songs, a lot of these tracks are still a lot better than the majority of the songs that ended up on Hardwired. I'm thinking 72 Seasons is maybe a 6 or a 7. Thank you all so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of this album in the comments below. Remember to like and subscribe. Check out my Instagram, my Reverb, and my Depop. Links to all of those are in the description below. Thank you all so much again for watching. We'll see you on the flip side.